Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSPs. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 28th of June 2023. Before we go to our usual starting point, the northeast sector of the front line, we're going to go and look at some general points that are pertinent to the frontline map and this video today. UK Defence Ministry has said the attack on the Chonhar Bridge has disrupted Russian logistics. The route closure after an alleged Ukrainian attack on the Chonhar bridges between Ukraine's mainland and the occupied Crimea on June the 22nd caused vital Russian logistics convoys to take at least 50% longer to reach the front, the UK Defence Ministry said. Now, add to that things are looking quite promising. This is from Tim White. I'm not sure what he's basing this on. Promising for the counterattack by Ukraine. It seems that Russia is struggling to get supplies, especially fuel, to the front lines quickly enough. The pinpoint missile strikes on Russian positions in the rear are weakening the invaders' defense. This is something that I've been talking about. Other analysts or loads of sources have been commenting that sooner or later the Russians will really start struggling with their supplies. And then this is from Alexei Reznikov, the Minister of Defense for Ukraine, says that Ukraine has not yet used the main reserves in the counteroffensive and some successes have not yet been reported. So there are successes you're not hearing about. They're not using the main force and Russia's logistics are really struggling. This could be a significant moment going forward. There could be some changes, or it could just be another couple of weeks of more grinding of the Russian lines, of their logistics to further degrade their capability. Now, at the same time, pro-Russian channel Rebar is claiming that large-scale purges are ongoing in the ranks of the Russian army, with officers being targeted for their indecisiveness in suppressing the mutiny. As always, Rebar, it's not an official source, so I would consider this unconfirmed. However, if this is happening, then all is not well in the state of Russia. Something is rotten in that state, and the tension between the MOD and Wagner PMC is only getting worse, and this could have ramifications on the front line with activities in certain areas, or at least we won't see Wagner coming back to be a force to be reckoned with within the conflict zones in any great number. Anyway, let's go to the front line. We're going to go to the northeast sector. Let's look at it on the war map. Looks like this. We're going to go to the Kupiansk to Svatva to Kreminna axis, this northeastern axis there. On my map, that looks like that, Kupiansk up there. Now, there isn't an awful lot of activity, really only in Makivka, with some repelled attacks there, which is sort of northwest of Svatva. The ISW mentions that there have been limited ground attacks in the area northwest of Svatva and south of Kreminna. The Ukrainian General Staff report repelled attacks at Makivka, and there are Russian claims that they are advancing. The VDV, their paratroopers, are advancing in the Kreminna forest. They're also being Russian attacks around, or failed attacks around Vesely and Rozdelivka. That's on the way to Bakhmut. The Russians, MOD, claim that they have repelled 2 Ukrainian attacks in the Liman direction and that Ukrainian forces unsuccessfully attacked near Bilohorivka and Spirna. Okay, so that is to say that there doesn't seem to be as much activity as there previously has been. Possibly some Russian advances in the forest area, according to the Russians, and some activity in Bilohorivka and Spirna as well, which is just there on the way to Bakhmut, that has seen activity in Vesely and Rozdelivka. So there isn't anything to say in the Kupiansk direction. I don't have any other sources. So we're going to go straight to Bakhmut here. Now, just to remind you that in this particular area, I have 3 colored lines that they refer to the Russian defensive lines. Ukrainian mapper Andrew Perpetua, pro-Ukrainian mapper Andrew Perpetua, has the Russian lines in blue. Pro-Ukrainian mapper Deep State Map has them in yellow, and pro-Russian mapper Syriac Maps has them in red. So that gives you an understanding of what different sources are saying with regard to where the Russian defensive lines are. Now, there are lots of claims about Bakhmut. Let's go to the ISW to give us a bit of an oversight. Ukrainian Deputy overview, sorry. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Malya stated that Ukrainian forces considered the Wagner Group Russian Ministry of Defense conflict when planning operations in eastern Ukraine, including around Bakhmut. Malya stated that Ukrainian forces have conducted counter-offensive operations and made advances on the flanks of Bakhmut for the fourth consecutive day. She stated that the Bakhmut situation is complex because Russian forces occupy extensive fortifications in the city, and that Ukrainian forces will advance more slowly. I mean, it's going to be grinding to take back the city. I would think that the Ukrainians would not want to get involved too much in the city and be more concerned with advances on the outskirts. Interestingly, there are some gains, as according to Syriac maps, in this area of the outskirts of the city there. So there's some mapping changes there, which is the first we have seen in the city area from Syriac maps, a pro-Russian mapper. Spokesperson Cheravati has stated that Ukrainian forces have the battlefield initiative in the Bakhmut area, and I would concur that is the case. However, geolocated footage posted on June the 27th indicates that Russian forces likely reduced Ukrainian tactical gains near Bakhmut. They've been counterattacking quite a lot around there. So Bakhmut is this area by the now empty reservoir that sits there, that large pond. So that is an area where the Ukrainians made some gains, were fighting on the outskirts of Bakhmut, and then the Russians did some really significant counterattacking around there to try and stop the Ukrainians. It's unclear whether the Russian forces, when they made these gains. So let's have a look at these. This is that the Russian infantry being hit by first-person view drone. That's to say Russian infantry are here. And that maps to... Okay, so Russian infantry is there, which means that deep state mapping might not be wholly accurate. That's not surprising. There's a 48-hour to 72-hour delay on deep state's map. I'm paying less attention to their mapping at the moment, and that does fall in line with both the other two mappers, where you would expect to see Russian forces. So, yeah, that could be a correct claim, but it falls in line with where my map is pretty much anyway, from ISW. Then there is quite a lot of activity to the south. I mean, ISW and the Ukrainians make claims that there is activity all around Bakhmut, all the usual sort of places are mentioned. So I probably don't need to say that. Yeah, they're attacking pretty much everywhere, the Ukrainians, but it seems that they are getting quite a lot of gains in the canal area, particularly around Kupiansk-Kreminna. They might well be operating on the eastern side of the canal. So no report says of the area. The Ukrainians cleared more area along the eastern side of the Donbass Canal. The 80th Air Assault Brigade progressed a kilometer into a forest strip. That's likely to be around the Klishivka area, likely south of Bakhmut. No further details about the exact direction, and that actually comes from Osman here, who's a fighter on the ground in Bakhmut. Progressed 1 kilometer. Or more than a kilometer in that area. No further details about the exact direction. Ukrainians are on the outskirts of Kupiansk down there. So some gains here. It could be that, I mean, forest can mean quite a lot of things. Normally, you would expect it to be something like one of these patches of woodland, possibly there. And oops, sorry, that's my fingers going a bit nuts. Sorry, there, and there are, I think there's trees around there. So those are the three main forest areas, and I think it's probably here that they're having more success. Let's see how far a kilometer is. So that's about a kilometer. So if that's the case, then that would be pretty much that tree line if it was there being taken, but it could be any of those. But it also, I mean, I'm not really sure you'd call it a forest, but there are tree lines going down the side of the canal, and we know that they have made some gains here in tree lines there. So in null reports, as you can see, that tree line coming down the side of the canal, they've made some serious gains in that area. So Tim White here showing a bit of footage. This footage has done the rounds. More territory reclaimed by Ukraine around Bakhmut. The Ukrainian flag is raised at the Kupiansk Dam, just south of Kupiansk Dam, south of the town. This video is from the 28th Specialized Rifle Brigade, named after Knights of the Winter Campaign, recorded 2 days ago. So this is two days ago. Interesting. and that has been geolocated to this position here. And again, what happens is there is operational security, so there are often gains that are made, and we don't hear about it till sometime later. Uh, that there is where they are in control, and this is a dam area there. So they've raised a flag there 2 days ago, which fits in line exactly with the changes to the mapping in this area at that point. So you did have some Russian, I think, yeah, it was, yeah, the Russians initially had this area, and then they had held on to this area, and then a few days ago, this last area there was taken. So the Russians have been cleared out from here. Ukrainians have placed their flag, and now the talk is that they are on the outskirts of Kupiansk. Arguably, they could be on the other side of the canal. Here is somewhere where you can cross the canal, because it seems to go under the ground there, as you can see. So they're going to cross anywhere. It's going to be here. At least that's the easiest place. However, if the Russians know they're going to cross there, then they can have their sights on that. You don't want it to be like shooting fish in a barrel. Anyway, that's Bakhmut. We'll just a few more things to mention. Are there? No, that's pretty much that. They are making gains, the Ukrainians. We're going to move on to Avdiivka now and Marinka. In fact, there's not a lot to say about Avdiivka. So we come out of Bakhmut, come further down south, and this is another area where there are 3 lines in most places around Avdiivka to show the 3 different mappers. Andrew Perpetua has shown some Ukrainian gains just around the road here. Very small amount of gains, to be honest. Just literally about that much. So some gains, but he's got it blue on his map as in there. It's not just kind of rejigging. It looks like the Ukrainians have made gains there, put pressure on. There's been some fighting around this area. Gains to the Russians were claimed within the last week, and gains to the Russians here as well. So it could be just a counterattack to rebalance the scales. Not much information about other places around here. The usual kind of, yeah, they are, fighting limited ground attacks, that kind of stuff. A bit of talk, Pervomaisky, but quite a bit of talk on Marinka here. Now, Russian state media outlet RT claimed that Russian forces in Marinka are making gradual advances, and that advancing Russian infantry occasionally order artillery strikes against Ukrainian positions just 15 to 20 meters away from their own positions, which is pretty insane. So that is what's taking place in Marinka, as in not too much. There are some gains on Suryat maps in this Staro-Mykolivka area that is kind of catching up, I think, with what has taken place over the last week. We had Andrew Perpetua saying that there are gains around there. There were some really big claims about this falling, but that was never going to be the case because, look, it's a pretty large place, Staro-Mykolivka. But anyway, that there's some small gains in that area. We know that the Ukrainians made some definite gains along the railway line just there between Staro-Mykolivka and Marinka. So, yeah, not too much detail about any territorial change or any detail about territorial changes around Marinka. We come out of there, passing over Mykolivka and onto Vuhledar. No information about Vuhledar today. I don't know whether that means nothing's happening, or they're just doing positional artillery duels, or whether there's stuff happening but we're just not hearing about it, operational security, etc., etc. And then we come on to the Velika Novosilka axis. So if we look at the wall mapper map, we can see that, there's activity going on in all the areas that we've previously seen. We go back to, in fact, Null Reports has some information on Velika Novosilka. This is in the Donetsk area, actually not in the Zaporizhia area. There is nothing on the Donetsk area, any other sources other than in the ISW. We'll have a look in a second. So Velika Novosilka axis, heavy fighting reported west of Staromyorska, that's the black outlined area there. Ukrainian units tried to force a breakthrough from Levadna and Rivnopil towards Pryutny. So this is to say, Staromyorska here, so Velika Novosilka, the towns down the river there on this low ground. You have the high ground where Rivnopil is, and just to the northeast of Pryutne. So there are Ukrainians trying to attack into Staromorska. As I said yesterday, they are trying to come in through that direction to kind of surround Staromorska as much as possible from three sides. At the same time, they are advancing towards Pryutne from the north and from Levadne from the west. So those are the areas that are under the most pressure in this neck of the woods. We're going to get rid of that. And we'll go back to the ISW that says interesting, actually. So this is still in the Donetsk area and not into Zaporizhia yet. The UK MOD has assessed that recent Ukrainian attacks have likely overstretched the DNR, Donetsk People's Republic, and Chechen forces operating in Donetsk Oblast. You know, the Chechens were pulled out during the whole Prigozhin mutiny affair. Don't know whether they have been reassigned, but yeah, it could be a bit of an overstretch for the DNR and the Chechens fighting in this whole area. But that is a kind of generalized statement. Okay, so the Ukrainians are making advances. They will be consolidating gains that they've made as well. Things are slow because they have to demine areas, booby traps, clear out buildings, clear out trenches and everything. It's not quick to do these. And remember, these are still probing attacks. They are using light equipment. This is none of the heavy equipment, like you don't see Challenger 2s. We're not seeing the Leopards really that we saw in one of the attacks or a couple of the attacks earlier in the counteroffensive. I think they've adapted to do lighter infantry based activities to try and take what they can, grind down the Russians, get them to commit their reserves, and then once the Russians have overcommitted and have there's been significant attrition of their forces, that's when the Ukrainians, I presume, will strike with their main forces. As for Marfapil, Drozhnyanka, as we can see, possibly activity around there, but don't really hear much about it. There's no explicit details. We go on to talk about Piatikhatki and the area around Orikhiv, to the south of. It's not. No, actually, we go on to. I'm getting myself confused. We're going on to Robotina here, where there are gains. This is south of Orikhiv and Malotokmachka. I was getting ahead of myself. So you've got Orikhiv there, that city that is north of Tokmak. You've got Melitopol, Tokmak, Orikhiv. So this area is important for making advances on Tokmak. Tokmak is being absolutely hammered. Again, it was last night. In fact, Tokmak, Mykolivka, and Melitopol were all three of these were really badly struck last night, I believe. So Robotina, there have been gains according to Suryat maps for the Ukrainians. They have made these advances. They are consolidating on those advances. And yeah, that's what we're hearing from there, from Suryat maps. So ISW is one of the, I mean, a few of my main sources don't say anything about Robotina today, but ISW does. The Russian MOD claim that Russian forces stopped a Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance group near Robotina. Why I've highlighted that is because this shows if they're still stopping sabotage and reconnaissance groups, this shows how light the attacks are, that they're still probing attacks. They are not main counter attacks using huge pieces of equipment and substantial numbers of equipment. They are just your reconnaissance and sabotage groups attacking. Rogov, Russian, has claimed that Ukrainian forces renewed attacks near Robotina to regain control of the previously liberated Ukrainian positions north of the settlement. The Russian forces had recaptured a couple of days ago. Russian Milblog, I had not heard that Russian forces had recaptured areas around Robotina. Russian mill bloggers claim that Piatikhatki remains in the contested grey zone. So if we come out, not a lot to report from there. There will be activity taking place for sure, operational security and all that. Robotina is this place just south of some major defensive lines, and still no confirmation as to whether the Ukrainians have definitely broken through the defensive lines, but I imagine they have if they are that close to Robotina, as many are claiming. And then we come over to Piatikhatki, where there's no changes to the mappers here. Much of the same for around that small settlement. But the ISW does report this. Russian mill bloggers claim that Pyatikhatki remains in a contested grey zone and that positional fighting is ongoing near the settlement. However, geolocated footage published on June the 27th shows that Russians are striking Ukrainian positions in Pyatikhatki. And this is the classic, it's contested or we half control that. If that's the case, why are you sending artillery in on Pyatikhatki? So if there's artillery being sent into Pyatikhatki, then that would assume that the Ukrainians are there and thus control it. So I'd assume Pyatikhatki, as I've said, is under the Ukrainian control, that Syriac maps isn't quite in accordance with accuracy there, and their lines should be further back. So that is what's taking place along the Zaporizhia front line. Not a huge amount of detail. There's much more detail coming out about the activity taking place across the Dnipro River in the Kherson area. We have the Antonivsky Bridge here, where the Ukrainians have got a foothold. The Russians have been pushed back somewhat. They still control something of the bridge area here, but otherwise the rest is kind of contested. In fact, Andrew Perpetua has the entire island area and delta of the river as contested grey zone, and he has the Russians pushed back to the far shore as definite control. Syriac Maps, on the other hand, has a much more charitable status for the Russian forces. They are still in control of most of the delta, as according to Syriac Maps, although there are a couple of areas that they have signified Ukrainian gains, just in this port area opposite Kherson and in the area we're talking about with regard to the Antonivsky Bridge. So we go to look at some of the sources here. No report says, despite shelling, the Ukrainians have managed to maintain the bridge and reportedly expanded the amount of personnel up to an amount of 120 men, possibly even more by now. Russians, because that was the same claim as yesterday, Russians complaining about the lack of aviation and artillery support and the presence of Ukrainian air defenses nearby. So apparently S-300 systems are operational in the area and are causing complications for the Russian defense there, as well as electronic warfare systems that are successfully jamming communications, which has meant that, as I've said before, the Russians have had to call in aviation close air support with telegram messages. So that's not ideal for a properly functioning, or what should be a properly functioning armed force. Footage of MLRS shelling of the right bank of the Dnipro. So the Russians are trying to hammer the Ukrainians with multiple launch rocket systems to stop them reinforcing the bridgehead that they have across the river here in these dachas around the beginning of the bridge. Rebar has made those claims, S-300 systems complicating the work of the Russian armed forces, but FPV, first-person view drones, and Larsen drones are losing their signals due to electronic warfare, and pontoon bridge or elements of pontoon bridges have been seen on the right bank of the Dnipro, right bank being the northern bank here as the direction of the river. As the water flows. So the right bank is over here, left bank is down here. There are elements of pontoon bridges that have been spotted. So you can assume that the Ukrainians are going to put together some pontoon bridges at some point and use them to aid their attacks. The question is whether this is just something to fix the Russians here, keep them distracted, or will this actually become a main area of Ukrainian counterattack, so that they can have some kind of pincer movement. The Russians are sending their reinforcements and reserves up to the Zaporizhia area because this is kind of the obvious point of attack. But if the Ukrainians can overcome the challenge of the dam being blown and the flooding taking place to cause Russians something to think about here, then the Russians will be split between, there will be like Buridan's ass split between two places, stuck in the middle, go, oh, where should we go? So anyway, lots of activity around the Antonivsky Bridge is definitely something to look out for. Loads of people talking about it. Ukrainian sources report that the Ukrainians are advancing in this city of Alishki, and there are active battles. Russian troops were knocked out from one strong point, and Russian sources report the advance is under artillery and mortar fire. and it's faltering. That Ukrainian attack is faltering, according to the Russians. Fog of war, but the fighting seems to have intensified as the Ukrainian reinforcements have brought, sorry, have are brought into the foothold. Is it still a reconnaissance in force, which at some point could change into a bridgehead? I mean, that's my question earlier. Either way, it seems to have reached a level of risk for the Russians in which it will serve its intended purposes. Which I suppose he's talking about the intended purposes of fixing and attriting Russian troops here, as opposed to necessarily kind of gaining territory. Anyway, that's the situation on the front line. There's significant activity there, and I think that's the thing to watch out for most of all today. I think the usual stuff will be taking place in the Zaporizhia, Donetsk, southern Donetsk area. There could be more advances there than we're aware of, but either way, it's going to be slow and attritional. Remember, these are just probing attacks still. I mentioned NWE War Reports this morning, who was like reporting how they've hit a brick wall. The Ukrainians like, nah, they've still. So remember, if I activate the amount of territory they've gained since the 30th of May, as according to the white line here of deep state map, so this is the Russian defensive lines, then I mean, yeah, they're not making crazily quick advances, but they've made more advances in 1 month than the Russians did in like 7 months or something. So it's about having realistic expectations uh, about the conflict, and I think it is probably harder than a lot of people had anticipated. But that's not really a surprise when they've had months and months to build those trenches, fix the minefields in place, and get their troops there to defend. So it's what you're going to expect. It might be a case, as many think, that slowly, everything happens all at once. And when everything happens all at once and you see those 35 brigades being suddenly brought into action rather than just the three, then things could be very, very different. And I think it's quite amazing that they seem to be making these gains in certain areas of the front line with their existing troops. So the Bakhmut, that we've been told that they haven't pulled from any of their counteroffensive troops there, and it seems the same when they're making these gains in Krasnohorivka area, and Stara Mikhailivka, and perhaps in the Avdiivka areas that they have. But again, they're using existing troops and not drawing on the counteroffensive capability. So I think that's really significant. But again, I'm pro-Ukrainian, so am I just trying to find the silver lining to the cloud? Could be, but I genuinely think that's the case. It's difficult, but the ducks are starting to line up. And when you see how much damage has been done to the logistics and to troop accumulations and to equipment behind the Russian lines, you realise that there could be a very brittle defence ahead for the Russians. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. I might have I'll probably transfer over an extra video from my Atypical Philosopher channel because I won't have electrics for most of the day, and give you that to chew on. But I may be able to do one a bit later. Anyway, really appreciate all your support. Take care and all the best.